7 years ago this weekend, I was at a motel down the street on Broadway Extension, right near 63rd Street. And I got up and I put on this shirt. Somebody looked at this shirt and said, "It's kind of fraying around the sleeves." I said, "Yeah, but I wore it for a reason." I put on this shirt because I was coming here to try out as the preacher. And I was coming for my one and only time because I knew about First Christian Church of Oklahoma City. I talked to a lot of people before I got here. I talked to people here in Oklahoma City, and I talked to people in the Disciples of Christ around the country who were friends of mine. And every one of them assured me that First Christian Church was dead. Not dying, dead. They said the remnant of the congregation just didn't know it yet. But over Christmas break, I was just driving down the street, and somebody had mentioned to me that this church was open, but they wouldn't be looking for somebody like me. But I hadn't been in this building in like 20 years. So I drove by, and the board chair happened to be here. And he and I had a conversation, and during the conversation, he goes, "What is your name?" And I said, "John Malget." He goes, "Hold on, that's familiar. I don't know why, but hold on." And he goes and gets on his phone, and he looks up his emails, or his texts, and he said, "Joyce Drew is our search committee chair. She's in Houston looking for you." Somebody down there, her daughter lived down there, somebody down there had given you your name. So I went, okay, well that's kind of a God thing. So I drove back to Houston, which we were planning to do. We drove through Waco on the way because, I had an interview with the church in Waco. And met with Joyce Drew the next morning over coffee. Figured if it was that much of a coincidence, I ought to at least go and do it. And so she convinced me to at least come and preach. What did I have to lose? I'm telling you, I came here with full knowledge that First Christian Church was dead. So I picked a text about a disillusioned people that thought that God had forgotten all about them. I want to read that this morning. It's Isaiah 40, 21 to 31. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, for you are our rock and you are our Redeemer, and you lead us on the journey. Amen. When this text was written, it was bleak. It was a desperate time for the Hebrew people. They'd been defeated in battle. Their temple lay in ruins in Jerusalem, and they've been hauled off to Babylon. And it appears that the Babylonian gods have triumphed over Yahweh. The Hebrew people were disillusioned. They were discouraged. They were weary. They had no hope. So God sends the prophet. He sends Isaiah to let the people know that God is about to deliver them. Have you not known? The prophet asks. Have you not heard? Haven't you been told from the beginning? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. Now the prophet understands the confusion and the sadness and the anger and the resignation and the yearning of the Hebrew people. But they don't understand that God has not left the exiles for lost. God has not given up on them to powers beyond their control. God is still active and working and present and available. Now, we may not always see how God is acting or how we understand what comes from turmoil, but that does not mean that God is not with us. We just spent Advent talking about Emmanuel, God with us. But sometimes as soon as that's over, we forget it. Isaiah writes words of encouragement. He reminds them that God is still with them and uses phrases that are obviously rhetorical. Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Don't you understand? Of course they know these things. They've been told them since they were little kids. Of course they knew that God was the creator of the heaven and the earth. Of course they knew that they would never be abandoned. They knew it, but they didn't know it. When things get difficult, sometimes it's hard to remember what we've known since we were kids. William Carl, a biblical commentator, calls it theological amnesia. Can our God still really help us? Does our God still want anything to do with us? We get the idea that perhaps God does not see, or maybe God doesn't care. What we discover in this part of Isaiah is a response to those doubts. And that response is a strong, relentless defense of God. God is the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint. He does not grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Gives power to the faint, strengthens the powerless. Youths fall weary, and the young fall exhausted, but those who wait for the Lord renew their strength. They mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Old Testament professor Walter Brueggemann puts it this way: this God is tireless, never faints. God is not worn out. God is not exhausted. God is directly attentive to the faint and the powerless, to those who have no energy of their own. In this context, Brueggemann says, of course, it is precisely the exiles who are resourceless, faint, and powerless. It is precisely for them that God is decisive. Not only is God strong, but God is willing to impart that strength to us. He gives power to the faint, strengthens the powerless. And it's a good thing that God strengthens us, because we human beings get tired. We grow weary, we get discouraged all the time. But God knows all about our frailty and provides us with sustaining help. Even those who are in the prime of their life, those who have the energy, those are the same people who get tired. This past week, I came home from this church literally probably 12-hour days this week because of everything that's going on. And I'm telling you, I was exhausted. And my wife was putting in even more time at a school. We get tired. But the Lord, those who wait for the Lord, shall renew their strength. And I'm not talking about a physical strength. I mean, I am, but I'm not. It's more than that. It's an inner strength that allows us to find hope again, that allows us to persevere. The inner strength from God that keeps us going, to get up the next day and keep going. Think of the exiles. It was a strength that allowed them to set out and make the journey back to Jerusalem. It's also the strength that allows them to persevere for 70-odd years, to put up with the discouragement and the disillusionment that they had when they were in exile. An inner strength. So this brings me back to the sermon I preached 7 years ago. I decided that I was not coming here before I even came. So I decided that I was going to preach an inflammatory sermon because I had nothing to lose. So I told a story about eagles, a legend about eagles, and I knew I was going to get tarred and feathered, but it didn't matter because I wasn't coming. So I still don't know if this is a true story or not, but there's a lot of truth to it. It goes like this. They say that the eagle is the most majestic bird in the sky. But something happens to all eagles. At least once in their lifetime, they molt. Now, like I said, half the experts that I looked at said this is a parable, and half of them said this really happens. I don't know.
It really happens.
But they go through this molting process that can bring with it a lot of depression. And this is a wilderness time that eagles face. Certain eagles live for 30 years or more, and then they begin to lose their feathers. And their beak and their claws alter. The experts tell us that during this time, the eagle will walk like a turkey on the ground because they don't have the strength to fly. The molting eagle finds themselves in the valley, unable to fly, with its feathers falling out. And then their eyes start to go. And their vision weakens, and calcium builds up on their beaks, and they can't even hold their heads up. And it's so traumatic and stressful. You know, it's just these majestic birds, to see something like this, it's just horrible. And they lose their desire to eat. Now, eagles only eat fresh meat, but they can't hunt. And then something else happens. When the molting eagles get in this last state, they begin to peck at each other, killing one another as they gather together in one place. You've never seen people turn on each other, have you? Not in the church. Now listen to this. At this time, they will choose some area of the mountain range where the sun can directly shine on them, and they'll lie on a rock and they'll bathe in the sun. And one writer said it's the most pathetic thing you will ever see. 4 or 5 eagles molting in a valley where they once would only soar and look for fresh meat. But if they don't renew, they're going to die. And they grow weaker and weaker. And suddenly you hear a screech coming out loudly. And overhead a group of eagles is flying, and they drop fresh meat over the dying birds. The screaming is encouragement. It is hope. And the meat is nutrition for their weakened bodies. And all of this screaming and the food from the other eagles, these eagles that have already gone through this, some of the eagles that are molting eat and recover. And others roll over and die. So me, preaching a sermon, knowing I was never coming here, said, so is First Christian Church of Oklahoma City going to be one of the eagles who lives, or are you going to roll over and die? Yeah. Nobody walked out. I asked the question because I'd heard all the stories of the infighting and the splits and the depression. You know, I didn't know really if there was truth to the rumor that, you know, people would almost come to blows and the police had to be called for an elders meeting, but it did happen. I had to decide if I was prepared to come to a congregation that was molting and dying. Could I come to a congregation that was willing to just roll over and let it happen? Nobody told me to come here. Nobody told me it was a good idea to accept a call here. Except, like Isaiah and a whole lot of other prophets and a whole lot of other people that I do know, sometimes God sends you a message that you really don't want to deliver. And sometimes God sends you to a place you're not sure you want to go. But I had a gut feeling that this was where I was supposed to be. I was in negotiations with the church in Waco, a very stable church in Waco. But that's not where my gut was sending me. It's not where God was sending me. So again, I ask the question today. Are we going to be one of the eagles that lives, or are we going to roll over and die? Now, I think if you look around this building right now, I think you know the answer. We are a people in the wilderness. But we're still a people of the resurrection. We listened when the prophet said, they shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. For the exiles in Isaiah's time, the eagle was a symbol of God's redemption. It was a symbol of God's intervention before, a symbol of the exodus from Egypt. An exodus to the promised land. In Exodus 19 it says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. God had been there before. God would help them again. The return from exile was a second exodus. But Israel had to wait. What does it mean to wait on the Lord? What does it mean for us to wait for God's timing? Waiting is trusting and hoping that God will be present and will guide us in our lives. And we as a congregation have experienced what it means to wait. We've waited these last few years, waiting for a sign that it's time. And it hadn't been easy. We find it hard to wait for pretty much anything. You know, impatience pervades our lives. Culturally, we expect instantaneous results. You know, we used to send a letter and would wait weeks for a response. Now we send an email and we're wondering why something hadn't come back in 20 minutes. We place our focus on the now, the urgent, the immediate, and we're so unwilling and unaccustomed to waiting for things to fully develop. To consider a longer view. The problem with being impatient is that it puts an emphasis on the perspective that is far too small and too limited. It leaves too little room for life to change, for life to get better. It fails to recognize that God is still very much at work in the process of creation in our lives and in this world. When we wait for the Lord, we operate on God's time instead of our own. God's people conform to God's design. God's redemptive purpose is at work in our lives and in our world. Therefore, we are not defined by our failings, nor by our past or present situation, but rather we are defined by the love and good purpose of God, God's promises, God's presence in our lives. For the Lord our God, we are truly destined to soar. Paul writes in Romans, but if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. That waiting thing again. Paul and Isaiah both had a long-term cosmic view of life. They're not focused on immediate troubles. Paul and Isaiah have their hopes and their expectations, and they're not limited just by present circumstances. They're looking beyond, trusting in God, for there is far more possibility than just what we might see right here. Wait for the Lord. So we've been waiting. I preached this sermon 7 years ago. We've been waiting. We see a few things happening, but we don't have 200 people in the sanctuary. God, what's wrong? What's the problem? But the congregation 7 years ago decided to be a people of the resurrection and not roll over and die. And we've not simply been passively sitting around not doing anything. We have worked towards change. We've been listening for God's call on the congregation. My first elders meeting I went to, I took a book called The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. They weren't happy about it, but they listed 11 items in the autopsy. But for the most part, it said that churches that die worry about how they are doing and cease to care about those outside of the congregation. They say, we're getting smaller, so we have to take care of ourselves. We can't afford to help others anymore. We have to make it sure that we can survive. And by doing that, they cease to follow the gospel. They still claim to love God, but the love neighbor part is too costly. So we set out to change that outlook over these last 7 years. And we've done it in a lot of different ways. Chain Reaction came to Oklahoma City. And if you talk to people around Oklahoma City and ask them what they know about First Christian Church, they'll tell you they know we give away bicycles. More and more people are starting to say, oh, Jewel Box is a part of you all? Because we're getting that word back out there. We help with Refuge Fellowship Church, both financially and through a lot of hands-on stuff. Before it closed, we worked actively with Edgemere Elementary School over here. We did a lot with mobile meals before that situation changed. And the biggest thing of all, we have come to understand that we are called to treat everyone as a beloved child of God. Everyone. We are called to love all the people, no matter what. No, we don't have 200 people yet worshiping on Sunday. And whatever will be, because that's up to God. But I want to remind you of another story that I told that first sermon. It was back in 1968. The country of Tanzania selected John Stephen Akwari, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, to represent them in the Mexico City Olympics. And along the race course for the marathon, Akwari stumbled and fell, injured his knee and his ankle. By 7 p.m., a runner from Ethiopia had won the race, and all the other competitors had finished and been cared for. And just a few thousand spectators were still in the stadium when the police siren at the gate caught their attention. And limping through the gate was number 36, Akwari. His leg was wrapped in a bloody bandage. And those present began to cheer as this courageous man completed the final lap of the race of this marathon. A little bit later, a reporter asked him what was on everybody's mind. Why did you continue after you were so badly injured? And he replied, my country did not send me 7,000 miles to begin a race. They sent me to finish one. Listening for God's call for this congregation and for our lives is not a sprint. It is a marathon. It's not been easy, and there are still those out there who say we're not going to make it. But we are a people of the resurrection. It's a journey that we're taking together. Don't get discouraged. Our closing hymn today is going to be Ours the Journey. And if you were in here early enough, you heard us sing it before worship. In this age of new dimensions and changing ways and scattered people wandering their separate ways, God is leading us on a journey. Jim Collins wrote a book called Built to Last, and he looked at 18 visionary companies and what obstacles they faced over the years. And he came to the thing is it wasn't because they had the best product ideas. It wasn't because they had charismatic leaders. All great ideas become obsolete and leaders come and go. But each had a sense of purpose that continues to guide and inspire people. A purpose that has remained fixed over time. Not just a mission statement that was written and filed away someplace, but an authentic purpose to which these companies align everything they do. In speaking of these companies, he writes, contrary to popular wisdom, the proper first response to a changing world is not, how should we change? But rather is to ask, what do we stand for and why do we exist? The timeless core values and enduring purposes of the church should never change. But the living out and the embodying of this purpose, our practices, our strategies should be changing constantly in response to a changing world. Our purpose shouldn't change, but we must be free to change everything else. We must experiment and learn by trial and error, and we've done a lot of that in these last 7 years. Audacious goals and dreams large enough to grab people and get their juices flowing. We must encourage dissent and debate and discussion and disagreement, yet remaining one. The eternal purpose, Christ as our creed, God's love. That doesn't change. But our strategies on how to present that to the world have to. We are and must be a resurrection people. New dimensions, changing ways. So as we continue in the wilderness, moving towards a new location, let us be willing to meet the circumstances of those who become a part of us in the future. As the song, Ours the Journey, says in its final verse, should the threats of dire predictions cause us to withdraw in pain, may God's blazing phoenix spirit resurrect the church again. God has not left us. We must be faithful and find new ways to serve God in this place and on this journey and in this time. God of rainbow, fiery pillar, leading where the eagles soar, we, your people, ours the journey, now and evermore.